friends. Welcome to episode 42 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian, starting my 13th year, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself and my interview guests are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Kath in New Zealand, Rachel and Damika in Texas. Madeline in New York reached out to me via email. She said, quote, I'm in my second year as an elementary teacher librarian in Central New York. I was a public librarian for about 5 years before that. I connect so much with your podcast. I am the only elementary teacher librarian in my district, so your podcast helps me to not feel alone. End quote. Well, I can tell you right now, there are some definite advantages to being the only person in your district who does your job. Namely, you are not compared. Imagine teachers who work for a grade level with 5 or 6 teachers who teach the same thing, or a subject matter teacher who works in a department with 11 or 12 teachers, all who teach the same thing. Invariably, there's going to be favorites. Somebody's going to be the hard teacher, somebody's going to be the easy teacher, somebody's going to be the good teacher, somebody's going to be the bad teacher, and there's going to be a teacher nobody wants because they're horrible. All I'm saying is when you are the only person who does your job in the entire district, it's great because you can't be compared to anybody. You get to define who you are, what your job entails, and everybody appreciates you because you're the only one who does that job. Anyway, I also wanted to say hello to Josette in Georgia. I met Josette on a Facebook group for librarians. She was very thoughtful to recommend this podcast in a discussion about podcasts for school librarians. Josette and I messaged back and forth, and I asked if I could share with her what she said on the podcast. Quote, I've been meaning to email you to let you know how much I've enjoyed listening to your podcast. I discovered it this summer and binge listened to every episode available at the time in a 2-week time span. I woke up every morning with a theme song ringing through my head. It's a catchy tune. Thanks for sharing with the world what we do. I'm a big believer in school library advocacy, and your podcast does a great job of explaining our often misunderstood profession and connects us with librarians to each other in a way that helps our sometimes lonely profession not feel so isolating. So thanks for that. End quote. I really appreciate hearing from listeners. I got to tell you, it really does help because I feel like this is reaching an audience who benefits from the effort I put together to create these episodes. And I love what I do. I feel that this is a really incredibly rewarding hobby. And if I have to spend my spare time investigating an episode that I know people will find informative, that's time well spent. I also want to say I had a really cool email from Amanda Jones, and Amanda Jones was my interview guest on last week's program about promoting your library program using social media. And if you haven't listened yet, Amanda Jones is one of AASL's social media superstars, and she shares her strategies in our interview, as well as resources linked in the show notes. So Amanda wrote me, quote, because of your podcast, some TV stations and local news outlets have done some stories about my efforts in using social media as a tool for advocacy. It's kind of embarrassing because I'm not used to the attention, but I hope it encourages other librarians to make that step towards using social media to their advantage. End quote. I asked Amanda if I could share that because that is a perfect example of how using this podcast platform to share the best our profession has to offer in a way that other librarians can hopefully bolster their own program, raise that profile, and in doing so, not only be more effective in our jobs, but hopefully secure our position for ourselves and those who follow us. I am also really excited because Amanda will be returning to the podcast later this fall to record an episode on alternative funding sources and stretching our budget. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and your episode suggestions either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And now, our episode on challenged and banned books. 19 years ago, I was a first-time mother and apparently a very poor cook. My baby daughter was eating Cheerios in her high chair a few feet away from me, and I was attempting to prepare dinner. To this day, I still have no idea how this happened, but whatever I was baking in the oven was overcome with flames. Panicked, I found a fire extinguisher under the kitchen sink, and I emptied the contents into the oven. I was so grateful to the homeowners before us because I know we didn't buy that fire extinguisher which put that fire out that day, and nobody plans on setting dinner on fire, and yet it stands to reason that everybody should have a fire extinguisher within reach at all times when they're in the kitchen. In case you're wondering, here's the pivot. In much the same way I wasn't planning on setting the kitchen on fire, so too do school librarians not start each day planning for a parent email or a request from the administration, hey, would you mind stopping by the office when you get a chance? In this case, our fire extinguisher, our collection development policy, needs to be at the ready for such a potential dilemma. By no means am I suggesting that you recite your collection development policy by chapter and verse, but knowing that you are protected and there is a procedure in place for the reconsideration of materials should mean that we continue to do our job without feeling impinged or vulnerable. And there's a very good reason why the topic of challenged and banned books was not an episode in Season 1. I don't come from a place of expertise, and I knew I needed to find someone who had taken the proactive steps to address challenges and reconsideration in their own library. I did record what remains my most controversial episode to date, and that is my self-censorship episode posted January 21st, 2019. I do not hold myself up as some gold standard in the face of contentious titles and parental interference with my collection. Rather, a self-avowed coward, I make safe choices, which keep me off the radar of parent Facebook groups, and most importantly, in my principal's good graces. One group funds a great deal of my annual purchasing, and the other is my evaluator, and in whose hands my employment security rests. Not only that, as I have always taught in elementary libraries, I wrongfully assumed that only older students would understand what it meant for a book to be challenged and or banned. I recognize this is a missed opportunity for me to shed light on the importance of our freedom to choose what we read and to not have that limited because of the fears of someone's personal beliefs. I'm going to be honest. I am aware that my lessons have a way of becoming dinner table conversations, mostly because our in-class discussions can be really engaging, but also because of time constraints. Our conversations can end abruptly so as to allow for checkout. Not every student gets to share as much as they would like, and I encourage students to continue these conversations at home as a way to convey to families some of the many lessons we address in library, such as plagiarism and fair use, cyberbullying, internet safety, netiquette, oversharing, databases versus Googling or Wikipedia. And I have no idea how my families will respond after I've had a conversation about challenged and banned books with their children, especially when I can't be sure how accurately this will be retold by elementary-age students. I can only imagine how this conversation would go. Parent says, "Hi, sweetie. Oh, I see you got a new library book we can read today. How was library?" Student says, "Oh, it was okay. We talked about books that are banned." Parent says, "Really?" Student says, "Yep, books like Harry Potter and Captain Underpants. These books get taken out of the library because people don't want their kids reading them." I'm going to let you imagine how this plays out. Either a 3-page email to the principal, a rant on the parent Facebook page. The problem is that when discussions in library are about plagiarism and cyberbullying, regardless of just how detailed the student's retelling is, the parents wouldn't question which side of the discussion the school librarian would be on. Furthermore, when so many of these titles, which have been challenged around the country, have never been an issue in my collection, am I inviting scrutiny? And will the very suggestion that other families around the country find these books objectionable going to generate an unwanted inquiry? If you have ever doubted at any point during this podcast just how transparent I plan on being, this confessional will surely put that question to rest. What happens when the person removing the book from your collection is your principal? I told a story in my self-censorship episode of, in my very first library, my principal came in and pulled Lane Smith's It's a Book and said it would be living in her office from now on. I can only imagine the stunned look on my face. I know words failed me, and I probably just stood there in shock. Side note, I did email Lane Smith, and he emailed me back and indicated that he wasn't surprised this happened to my copy of his book. If there is a procedure for reconsideration initiated by a school administrator, I haven't seen it. Furthermore, like so many school librarians around the United States and around the world, our positions are not to be taken for granted. Why jeopardize my place in the school community with the one person who could easily decide my skills are no longer needed? I use this podcast as an excuse to see what the ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom has to say about my principal removing a book from my library. Because this was an informal complaint, not a formal process of reconsideration, quote, no library resources should be removed or restricted from use as a result of the informal complaint. What I should have done would be, depending on your own district, I assume, would have started with me contacting my union president and perhaps my department chair, and going from there. It is because of this personal experience that I had that I regard what happened in Tennessee several weeks ago in St. Edward's Catholic School with some idea of the emotions the staff might be experiencing. I will attach a link in the show notes to an article originally posted on August 31st, 2019 by Heather Meyer of thetennessean.com. Copies of Harry Potter were removed from the school's library. This decision was made by the school's pastor, the Reverend Dan Reel. An email states an explanation, quote, these books present magic as both good and evil, which is not true, but in fact a clever deception. The curses and spells used in the books are actual curses and spells, which, when read by a human being, risk conjuring evil spirits to the presence of the person reading to the text, end quote. Additionally, the superintendent of schools for the Catholic Diocese of Nashville, Rebecca Hamill, stated, quote, we really don't get into censorship in such selections other than making sure that what we put in our school libraries is age-appropriate materials for our classrooms, end quote. The superintendent continues, quote, the goal is to promote engaging quality literature and an enjoyment of reading in hopes of building student skills and knowledge, end quote. And this is me saying, schools make all sorts of decisions on behalf of students in their care, and parents similarly make choices as to which school they feel will best raise their children with the values which align to those taught at home. However, when you think of the attention this story has received, and that every student in that building is aware that they are not allowed to read Harry Potter while at school, I have to imagine that regardless if there are copies in that library or not, it is more than likely that students will be reading Harry Potter to spite their school's administration. I am thrilled to introduce you today to my guest, Deb Zeman, who provides a perfect contrast because, unlike my own cautious approach to banned books, Deb is bold in setting the example. Not only is Deb leading the charge in her building during Banned Book Week, she is also a leader in her district. Listen to her talk about making sure her district had a comprehensive collection development policy in place to guide the library programs in all 6 buildings. I've attached a link to her website so listeners can review and even consider updating their own library policies. And now, here's Deb Zeman. Tell us a little bit about your journey. How long have you been a school librarian? And let's start there.
Sure. I've been a high school librarian for the past 4 years. I got my degree last winter from University of North Texas. I became a librarian. Well, first of all, I love to read. But secondly, they asked me to move up because of both my ed tech experience plus the library. And that's how I became the librarian.
Fantastic. Tell me, you are in a high school. Can you tell me a little bit about your some of your programming, some of the what does your day look like?
Well, if you ask my best friend, who's the digital learning specialist, I'm the queen of breakout, both digital and physical. It's a high school 9 through 12. This year has been really the year that I've actually been getting into the classroom with teachers during their PLC time, brainstorming, information literacy. Down here in Texas, we have what's called TextQuest, and that is to access all the databases that we have access to, so all Gale. So I've been getting into classrooms when they're doing research and showing the kids, Boolean operators, how to properly research, how to use TextQuest with Google, because you can sign in and it'll go straight to your drive and they never have to go out to Google for a random search. Again, the one big thing I'm really big with research and with collaboration is Wakelet. Have you heard of Wakelet?
I'm yes. Vaguely familiar.
Love Wakelet. It is truly the 5th C of the 4 C's, the collaboration. So we've been really pushing that this year at school, and the teachers love it. I've created resource boards for all the teachers, and then I've been working on resource boards for each subject.
That's really fantastic.
Yeah, my day, if you saw my calendar, you'd see all the red.
I got it. Tell you, I was really struck because I noticed you were posting about Banned Books Week earlier than I've seen in others, and you were sharing, which is always refreshing. Could you tell me a little bit about how Banned Book Week is represented in your collection?
Well, when I went to library school, that's when I really truly first learned about it. And, my first year in the library, I had to clean up and weed and, I didn't want to do too much. The second year I was in there, I just started promoting banned books and giving, here's the picture of the book, here's an explanation and whatever. And same with last year. But this year, something has just clicked where I'm like, okay, I've seen too many things where people are being reprimanded for, why do you carry this book and that book? And so this year I've started early but slowly, I started a contest at my school called the Shredded Book Contest to get kids to come into the library, not to just play the game, but look what's in here. Okay. So then I'm like, you know what? I can do this with Banned Books Week. So I'm in the process. If you look on my Twitter, you'll see little pictures of stages of what I'm doing. I did pick a book that is popular on the Banned Books Week that I got from ALA page. Don't want to say what it is.
I was going to say, don't give it away, but you did have to destroy at least part of that book to make this activity.
Yes.
For the benefit of people who have not seen your post, and I can attach an image in the show notes. But if you would explain this project for anyone who's not seen it on Twitter.
Book. Okay. So
yes, the Shredded Book. I've seen it.
It is. And the first book I did was a weeded book. It is out of the inventory. It was destroyed. And it was actually the Odyssey. I figured, let's start something easy. I didn't even have to put clues out there. Now with the banned book, what we have down here is called half price books. I don't know if you have anything up by you by that. And I went in and I literally went over to the remainder where this is it. It's like a buck. There's no way they're going to have one of these books. And sure enough, up on the shelf, there it was. I went, boom. But what I'm doing this time is I'm not shredding the cover. I think the direction, you want to take the book and do it, I guess you could say, horizontally. Because if you do it vertically, they kind of can see it. So I'm actually shredding the book tomorrow. I've got the giant jar. And what I'll do is I usually leave it out for a day or two, let the kids take a look. If they are just, nobody's putting anything in, then what I'll do is I'll just put a hint. Might be something about the author. Might be, I've seen one where it was just the author's birth date, which just drives the kids crazy. They're like, yeah, but we don't know who it is. And again, it's related to Banned Book Week. And then in October, I'm going to do a horror novel, which again, I bought at Half Price Books. November, I was thinking of Thanksgiving, but there's a very big movie that's coming out. And I found a book that was related, and I can shred that one. And then the Christmas time, I'll do a holiday book.
Can I ask, do you have the kids submit paper entries or
No,
do they
it's
enter in a
Google
Google form?
Mm-mm.
Google form. Okay.
When you see my image, you'll see that I did a QR code. We're a one-to-one campus with iPads, so the kids can just scan it on their phone or they can scan it on their iPad and they enter. So this time around, I had only 10, but I put an announcement in classroom. Congratulations to, and the girl that won, and she got a $10 gift card to Chick-fil-A. I'm bumping it up where it's going to be $15 to Whataburger.
I can imagine that you will get some participation if you throw in a food incentive. I love that. Going back to how you talk about promoting banned books in your when you do like your reader's advisory or can I ask you, do you specifically explain why these books were initially banned or challenged or what people found objectionable about that? Because sometimes I think kids are rather incredulous and they're like, what objection would you have to, Charlotte's Web? And yet it is a banned book.
Exactly.
Yes.
So it was funny on Friday, one of my girls, my student library aide, she's helping me with the display. And another one of my girls, I'm a co-teacher for a student ed tech team, Celina SWAT, everybody knows who they are. And we were talking about it, and one of the girls said, explain to me what challenged or banned is. And I said, well, it's when someone doesn't like the material or the subject matter of the book, so they will challenge it. And they were like, okay, well, what are some of these books? And the one girl who's the library, and she's got all the pile and she's looking through and she's like, To Kill a Mockingbird. She starts yelling across the library. She says, why? I said, because of the N-word. Okay. I said, I'll give you an example. Whenever I was in the English and as a teacher, I would do a disclaimer. I'm reading the book as is. If you don't like how it's read, you could step out in the hallway. I said, if it's like reading that, it's reading Mice and Men. If you change the language, the dialect of those characters, you change the whole story. So we were talking about that. And then they were like, well, what other ones? What about kids' books? I go, Dr. Seuss. Nuh-uh. I said, I swear. What's the other one? Captain Underpants. They lost their minds. They're like, but why? And so I pulled up ALA and I said, that it causes disruption in the classroom. They're like, kids just yell things out in the classroom. I said, people are thinking. And so what I tell them, I go, I use this example. If you don't like the show, turn the channel. If you don't like the book, nobody's making you pick it up and buy it. But again, kids have that right to read. There's that student's right to read through NCTE, the Library Bill of Rights. It's intellectual freedom. You have the choice. But you have to respect the parents at the same time. And I actually had an argument one time. Well, I won't say argument. I had a disagreement with a parent about 13 Reasons Why a couple of years ago. Have you heard of the Junior Library Guild?
Of course.
Okay, they have the subscription. Well, it was in the subscription to the junior high. the library there called me and I said, oh, let's just transfer it up to the high school. It's a high school age book. And somebody who worked for the district happened to catch me in the front office and said, oh, well, I saw that book was there. I said, no, it is no longer there. It's up here at the high school. Well, I just don't agree with it, that show. I said, have you ever read the book? You have to read the book. I've never seen the show. I choose not to see the show. Well, it's got material in there. And I said, that students deal with all the time. And I said, you can hear them talking about stuff walking down the hall. I said, if you're choosing, she said, well, I'm not going to have my freshman read it. I said, well, then you can give me your child's name and I will make a note in the system. And if she tries to check it out under her name, I'll say, well, I have a note in here, Mom has said no. But if she tries to check it out through her friend, I can't stop her.
Well, and also through the public library.
Exactly.
Because I'll have students come to me because I'm an elementary media specialist, and students will ask me for books which we offer in the middle school and up.
Right.
And I'd say to them, listen, I'm going to show you in our OPAC which public library branches have them. Go there after school. You're welcome to check it out.
Yeah.
I said, but we have at the elementary level, we're going to keep a lot of the middle grade books in middle school. And those are decisions which I think also reflect just how well you know your community and just how well you know building the relationships with your parents. The handful of times that objections have been raised with me, the parents started to ask questions, and what we recognized is that they really just didn't want their child reading the book. And once we assured them that, and again, a conversation with your child about the expectations you have when it comes to them checking out books. This is something that students are enjoying, this freedom, and yet they also have to be mindful of their parents and what kinds of expectations they have.
Which is what I told the girls, because they couldn't understand Harry Potter. And one girl said, it says fantasy, pretend. I said, but some people perceive it. And I told them about the recent challenge.
Oh, there was
in,
a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. And they just couldn't understand it. And I said, well, it could have been a big, massive group. I said, you just don't know, and you have to go with it. And then I bring up self-censorship. And they said, have you ever not gotten a book? I said, well, there may be some that I don't get because of the community we live in. And I don't want that risk. I said, but that genre of book I've been building up. So as the community grows, you have to cater to everybody. And they were like, okay, they got it.
Well, I did record probably the most controversial episode last season, which was called Self-Censorship. And I certainly will come out and call myself the coward that I am, because I don't choose to step outside the boundaries that I feel I have because of the community I serve, and their children that I serve.
Right.
And so I also understand that every book that my students need and want can also be found across the street at the public library. So I'm not depriving them of something because we live in a book desert. I am in loco parentis, taking care of the children who have been placed in my care.
Right.
And, if you want to listen to Self-Censorship, an episode that I recorded last season, and yes, I did get some pushback, and it was primarily from public librarians who listened to that episode. And arguably, they don't have the same types of obligations obligations to their families. I was very intrigued before we started recording. You described your process for seriously revising your district's collection development policy.
Yes.
And I think that's really something that I'd like you to describe if you could, because I'll be honest, not everybody has ready access to their collection development policy and can cite it chapter and verse. So tell me what you're about your experience.
Well, one of my assignments was locating and reading over and analyzing our collection development policy. And I actually had to kind of dig around in my office. And when I found it, I discovered that it was out of date. I won't say how long ago, but it was pretty long ago. And it was piecemeal. It wasn't just one giant thing. So I went to my mentor and asked her, okay, what do I do? And she said, hang on. She sent me a link and said, you take whatever you need from ours and you build your own. And so it took me about 6 months. I built a library services website. I built a high school website, and I rebuilt the policy. And I did get the blessing from my superintendent. He said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just tweak it to fit us. And that's exactly what I did. Obviously removed the other school out, but updated, added in the library bill of rights, added in all the different things that you really truly need to have. And then just last spring, I turned around and created a 60-page handbook for each of the library campuses, which had the reconsideration policy, anything and everything in terms of like technology, databases, the reconsideration, everything, just to make sure we were up to par. And as we were talking earlier, believe it or not, literally I hit publish on the website. I got everything going. And 2 weeks later, I got an email from the primary principal saying that a parent wanted a picture book removed. So I said, okay, are you sitting in front of your computer? She said, sure. And I just zapped her with like 15 documents, one of which was the policy, the reconsideration policy. She sent it off to the parents with the form letter that we had. I said, just go in, make a copy for yourself, fill in your campus, your name, send it off to them. It's everything you need. I waited a couple weeks. I emailed her and I said, did you ever hear anything back? She goes, nope, I think you scared the parents off, because I hate using the word, armed with what I needed to protect the collection.
It's very wonderful hearing about that, because I think I think that experience has probably been something other people have shared as well, because all too often a fuss is raised and it's based on incomplete information.
Exactly.
And all too often parents are really just trying to protect their child, and they're not all that concerned whether or not other people's children read these books. It's really about if their children read these books.
Right.
I really would appreciate, would you mind if you allow me to put a link to your library resources?
Sure.
So, friends, when you look at the show notes, you'll be able to see this masterpiece, which has been put together. And, I'll be honest, I think that we're all of us have similar concerns when it comes to challenges. And it is about being prepared. It's like having that life vest and hoping you never have to use it. It's like having an insurance policy. We don't want to use it. Right. We just need to know it's there. And
you need that, because if you don't have it, you have to remove the book. And that was my biggest fear. As soon as I learned about collection development, I was like, okay, is somebody going to come in here and say, no, you can't have 13 Reasons Why. No, you can't have Harry Potter. They're popular books. The kids love them. So,
well, and you also had the important step of having all of this approved by your Board of Education.
Yes, it was approved by the superintendent, the board, and everybody. And they would never have allowed me to make the website if I didn't.
Sure. Let me ask you, I have a lot of listeners who are brand new to the profession, and I always like to share my mistakes with listeners, but, I didn't know what to do when a book was taken out of my library. And I'll be honest, I was so stunned that words failed. And that's happens, rather strange for somebody who talks a lot. But could you share with our listeners, what would you suggest to some of our newer librarians who really have never experienced a concern raised by parents or by community members when it comes to books in their collection?
Just make sure you have that collection development policy. Make sure it's truly up to date. Go to ALA, go to their link for the Office of Intellectual Freedom. Go to NCTE. They have the resource. Common Sense Media. That's another one, because I have referred parents to that site, because you'll see that you put in the book and then it'll come up and it'll tell you. And I've actually, as I've been, labeling my display, I've been using what they're saying plus what I found on, what's the other one? BannedBooksWeek.
Sure.
Yeah,
friends, I'll include all those links in the show notes.
But just have that documentation. That is going to be your lifesaver. Get a experienced librarian. If you're new, go talk to your library director. Your library director would be your go-to person who would then go up the ladder. But everybody should have it. That's why I turned around last year and said, all right, here you go. Everybody's got this. They've got a backup. If anything should happen, you know where to go to in the handbook.
That's really great advice. Deb, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your evening to share your experience. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
You're welcome.
I'm so grateful that Deb could make time to share with us her experiences and her resources on this podcast. As with everyone I have interviewed thus far, the conversation I have with my guests go well past when I stop our recording. Deb shared with me that during Banned Books Week, she planned a breakout activity using clues from the ALA infographics for her classes. She also pulled more than 200 books which have either been challenged and or banned for a book tasting with her sophomore ELA classes. I really want to encourage you to spend some time visiting the website Deb created for her district. I'll attach a link in the show notes. It's called the Celina ISD Library Services website, and in it she includes statements regarding her mission and vision, author visits, advocacy, collection development, collection evaluation and assessment, copyright databases, online subscriptions, operating procedures, professional development, purchasing procedures, reconsideration of library materials, standards, and resources. You can follow Deb on Twitter at Deb Zeman LMS, spelled DebZemanLMS. For any listeners who enjoy reading advice columns, I've got a great recommendation. Pat Scales is a former chair of ALA's Intellectual Freedom Committee and the author of multiple books on teaching banned books and defending books when they are challenged. In her column in the School Library Journal titled Scales on Censorship, Pat Scales responds to readers' questions related to censorship and has more than 60 archived articles. I find myself, as with any time I read advice columns, trying to anticipate how the expert would rule. I've made sure to include a link in the show notes. I will also include links to ALA's Intellectual Freedom blog, as well as ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom's page on Banned and Challenge Books resource page. Because there are some podcast fans listening today, I wanted to share with you some recommended listening podcast episodes all about banned books and Banned Books Week. Again, I will be sure to include links to every single episode I reference from here on out. First of all is NPR's Sam Sanders' It's Been a Minute, and his interview with Angie Thomas and her thoughts on her book, The Hate You Give, being challenged. Another podcast I really enjoy listening to is called No Ed All, with hosts James Lampy and Emily McGuff, who host a weekly conversation on classroom news and tech reviews with guest educators. They have a series of 4 episodes this month, all devoted to the conversations of banned books. KidLit These Days with Matthew Winner and Karina Yan Glazer, episode number 14. The description reads, quote, Karina and Matthew talk about why books get banned, what books' titles appear on ALA's most challenged book list, and why Banned Book Week is a great time for celebrating. Joining is special guest Sonali Kumar, the middle and upper school teacher librarian at the Washington International School in Washington, D.C., and the author of the Unschooled Librarian blog. Another podcast called Checked In, a Missouri Association of School Librarians podcast, is hosted by Ethan Evans. On September 16th, he posted an episode in which he, quote, discusses stealing a book tasting idea and how things never turn out as they do in pictures. He also has a discussion with MASL, that's Missouri's Association of School Librarians, AASL's rep, Victoria Jones, about book challenges and the resources that school librarians have at their disposal, end quote. I think that was a great episode, and I don't want to repeat what's been done in other episodes. I think every podcaster brings their own personal style to this topic, so I really enjoyed listening to what Ethan had to ask, and Victoria Jones was a wealth of resources. Another recommended episode was on Scholastic Reads podcast, and this was recorded last October 2018. Suzanne McCabe is the host, and she had a riveting conversation with Alex Gino, who you probably recognize is the author of one of the most challenged books out there presently, and that is George. While on the topic of podcasts for librarians, I neglected to mention at the beginning of Season 2 that I was published in a professional journal over the summer, all thanks to this podcast. If you heard my episode this past March titled Podcasts and You, then you weren't alone. Some listeners in Australia also heard the episode and shared the link with an editor for SCIS, or otherwise known as Schools Catalog Information Service. You may see them on Twitter as @SCIS Data. They are, according to the description on Twitter, a not-for-profit cataloging service for school libraries across the world. It continues, we care about literacy, education, and advocacy. And in April, an editor reached out to me, and in May, I submitted my article for review. My article is titled The Value of Podcasts for School Library Staff, and it was published in late July. I'll include a link in the show notes. There's a great deal of overlap with my related episode. It is fun because there's a breakdown of podcasts to support literature in our collection, teaching strategies, and educational technology. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Deb and to everyone whose resources made recording this episode so meaningful, and to the listeners whose feedback helps plan the direction of upcoming episodes. Be sure to visit the show notes for links to lots of resources and related podcast episodes on the topic of Banned Books Week. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions, either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. I'd like to thank you for listening today. It has become readily apparent that some of you have been sharing this podcast with your departments and your PLN. If you find value in listening, there's a chance you know someone who might feel the same. The topic of our next episode will be advocacy at the district and state level, including interviews with Margaret Sullivan and Kathy Lester. I hope you will tune in.